Hello, everybody. Time for part two of Houses for the Dead. Gonna jump right back in where we left off yesterday. The next morning, Timothy awoke to the smell of coffee. His grandfather was already out of the house. He never really heard his grandparents speak to each other anymore. He remembered them being quiet, but now they no longer even said, "Pass the potatoes," or "Can you get the door for me?" They didn't seem unhappy, but there was no immediate indication that they needed to talk. Timothy suspected they'd worked out another plan, another system, the way he and his friends did when they were playing spy games. The kitchen looked smaller during the day. Once again, his grandmother said nothing about the missing food or the dishes in the sink. In fact, Timothy couldn't remember the last time he'd heard his grandmother say anything at all. He sat down at the table, and she set a bowl of oatmeal in front of him. "Good morning, Grandma," he said, but she didn't reply. Not in words, anyway. She placed her hand on his head and rubbed. She sighed with a breath so long Timothy thought she'd begun whistling. She smelled of dough, and her apron was dusted in flour. On the counter, a jar of molasses sat in front of the tin canisters. The mixing bowls and measuring cups were in the order which they would be or had been used. The countertop was covered in flour, shortening, vanilla, raisins, brown sugar, a mess that she would sweep into a bucket and empty in the bins outside the back door. "How come you don't eat the raisins?" Timothy said. She turned to look at him. Though she was not yet 70, she was the oldest person Timothy had ever met. She still walked nearly 5 miles a day. Once after breakfast to the cemetery, except on Sundays, and then again, unless it was snowing, down past the cemetery to Mint Street, where she got what she needed for dinner or breakfast at Barker's store. "How come you don't go to the supermarket, Grandma," he asked, "and buy stuff for the whole week?" She hadn't had an answer for him, but had looked instead out the window down High Street and smiled at the birds jumping over the lawn and pecking at the seed she'd dropped beneath the buckeye and splashing not only in her bird bath but in the bird baths of each neighbor, as far as she could see. Timothy understood, even without an explanation. Who wouldn't want to walk down that street as much as possible? Who wouldn't want to retrace each step hundreds and hundreds of times? His grandmother was born in this house, as was his own mother and his Uncle Raymond, plus the two that didn't live. For much of her life, his grandmother's family had not even owned a car. One of the men in the cemetery, Edward, or maybe William, or Ollie, had owned a truck, a big dusty Ford with swooping fenders and a grill that looked like a mouth, and he'd come once a week to take his grandmother and her 3 sisters wherever they had to go. They'd all pile into the bed and bump downtown, or to Fairport, or Winston, or to work, or to the Grange Hall in Parkville for dances. Timothy had studied the pictures stored in the big straw-colored suitcase, and his grandmother had let him keep the picture of her standing on the hood of the truck, balancing, arms out. It was blurry, and the faces of the boys standing below her were eerie. They had both moved slightly as the photo was snapped, and their faces seemed to be in 2 places at once, looking at the camera and looking at each other, 2 noses each, 2 chins, 4 eyes. But his grandmother was whole and grand and pretty, looking as if she were standing on a diving board. He told her that he was sorry she had to get old because of how pretty she was. Her body shook with laughter, though he wasn't quite sure what was so funny. After he finished the oatmeal, he went down the back steps and into the backyard and down by the burn pit. His grandfather had Martin houses up on big poles, and the little purple birds sat on the clothesline and along the fence and on his grandfather's magic house. His grandfather would go inside and not emerge for hours. "What are you doing there?" Timothy asked. His grandfather put his hands up next to his face and pretended to be asleep. He showed Timothy his belt buckle, which was a brown stone with yellow streaks through the middle. It matched the ring he'd made, too, and the tie clip and the bolo tie clasp, and dozens of other pieces of jewelry. His grandfather had never let Timothy into the room before, But today, when Timothy stood on his toes and peeked through the bottom pane in the window, he saw his grandfather holding something and looking right at him. His grandfather was named Paul, but Timothy had never heard anyone call him anything other than his last name, Pearson. His left eye was glass, and it was a slightly different color than his regular eye, and Timothy couldn't help but look at the glass eye, even though he understood that it couldn't see. He swore that the glass eye moved, and sometimes when his grandfather removed the eye and set it into its case, Timothy was sure that it could see better and farther than the real eye, and could remember too. His grandfather crooked a finger and motioned to the door. Timothy ran to the door, and his grandfather opened it and swooped his arm down low like Timothy was a prince being welcomed into court. Inside, his grandfather took down the stool he had just finished building. It was sturdy and smooth, and when Timothy stood on it, he was able to rest his body on the workbench counter. His grandfather took a cigar box of stones from the shelf and poured them on the table. They'd been polished in the tumbler and gleamed in the morning sun. Timothy put his hands into the pile and let the stones drip through his fingers. "They're all so pretty," he said. His grandfather took a marker from a cup and wrote across the top of the box, "Timothy's box of stones." Next, he showed Timothy a box of unfinished stones and began teaching him the simple process of polishing them. They worked until nearly lunchtime. Timothy, giddy with excitement at each new tool or at each new step. His grandfather smelled like pipe tobacco and wore suspenders and a long-sleeved shirt, even though it was hot. They were both surprised by a loud bang against the window. His grandfather frowned, and they went outside to see the martin flapping on the ground. It was the first time all day that Timothy had thought about his parents, or the 2 empty beds in his bedroom, or the loud office he had to go to on Thursday mornings before school to talk to Mr. Mincelli about how he felt, or of the blank stare his mother wore when she told him they were moving, but without his father, or the time he'd been with Lucas Fletcher's family at the mall and he'd seen his dad sitting at a table at the food court with a woman that wasn't his mother. Mrs. Fletcher had taken his hand and guided him into J.C. Penney's, and he pretended that he hadn't seen anything. "Why did he hit the window?" Timothy said. His grandfather pointed to the sun. Timothy followed the line of his long arm and his thin, flat fingers. They seemed to press against the sun's surface. The light swallowed the entire hand to the wrist. "Do you think he'll be okay?" Timothy said. The bird was pushing itself in a little circle, one wing flapping slowly and its head pressed to the ground. His grandfather shook his head and reached down to cup the bird in both hands. The bird disappeared into the canopy of his palms, and although he did not seem to apply any pressure, when he opened his hands, the bird was still. Together they walked down past the fire pit and into the long grasses beyond. They gathered stones and piled them on top of the bird. Timothy put a small, polished pebble on the top of the cairn. They stood for a time and watched the other birds circle above, swooping low, then arcing high above the trees. Thanks. Part 3 tomorrow.